Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Marika Mikiashvili. She is a researcher at Alte University in Tbilisi and she is a party member of DRUA party, and she also worked for the Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome, Marika.
Thank you very much, Sergej. It's an honor to be here with you.
Thank you that you have found time for this conversation. You're in Tbilisi now, in Georgia, capital of Georgia, where mass protests are ongoing since weeks and weeks, and there is violence already since many days, and it is not a safe situation. So thank you very much that you have found time for this conversation amid the challenging events. Can you explain what is going on right now in Tbilisi and how is the situation this week?
Thank you very much. Yes, this week saw the third vote on the Russian law. We call it Russian law, the foreign agents law. And the situation is getting quite tense. However, today there are no demonstrations because today is anti-homophobia day, but this day was declared by the Church of Georgia as a family sanctity day. So they're having their church marches today. So we decided not to confront them or have any reason for provocation. So we are having a timeout for today. From tomorrow on, I'm sure there will be a continuation of student protests and more rallies will be announced. Well, we are at the critical juncture when the grassroots, mass, decentralized, self-organized movement has proven its strength and has spread throughout the country. And now is the time when people are already demanding that this should be channeled into political process, and political parties should be assuming a more visible public role in all of this. So yeah, we are at the juncture when the self-flow of the protest has to meet the political channeling of the protest, and we should see it happening in the upcoming weeks.
But the protests, they already they continue ongoing since many weeks, and we have seen hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of Tbilisi, which is a lot. And Georgia is not a country of millions and millions of people, and Tbilisi is not a city with tens of millions of people. So it's a lot of people on the streets. And can you explain what was the reason for this mass protest? Like, is it only about one law?
Yes, of course. So if I might go a little bit back in time, you probably know, but that the first attempt to introduce this law was in 2023, so last year, March. And I remember when, like in the days before the March 2023, when we were discussing with other opposition parties and CSOs, what should our reaction be? How do we manage to resist this law? None of us were sure that people would actually come out and protest. And we were thinking, okay, let's at least have demonstrate a big resilience and big resistance inside the parliament so that we show that the opposition and CSOs are really against it. And no one expected last year in March to have such a large scale of protests. It was more than 100,000 on March 7, 2023, when the law was adopted at first hearing. It was then followed by a crackdown, which saw even bigger crowd on March 8, and then was another crackdown then. So after 2 days of major crackdowns and more than 100,000 demonstrators, maybe even 150, the government backed off last year. Before the no to Russian law could become no to Russian government. So they were sensing that their situation was getting out of hand, and they did not they did not expect such a punchback from Georgian protesters, because Georgian protesters always used to be way more timid, and Georgians would be quite shy and afraid not to be labeled as aggressive by the government. However, the Gen Z, the young generation, last year, they proved that they're not that concerned with whatever government labels them, and they are very effective in giving a punchback to the crackdowns and to the police, and they self-organized really well. They put up barricades and so on. And to a large degree, it was a like mental cultural revolution, the way we resisted the crackdown last year in March. So that is what the government did not expect, and they backed off before the no to Russian law could become no to Russian government. And now we see that they had a whole year of planning ahead how to deal with possible protests next time they would bring this law. And yeah, so this year we won the European football qualifier to Euro 2024, and the entire nation was extremely happy and celebrating for a week. And that was when the Russian law was brought back, and the people were very, very pissed off that they wouldn't let us be a happy nation for even a week. And why would they bring it back? Especially the second time when the public already rejected this law once. And yes, there was this sense of big insult. And of course, we did anticipate big rallies. However, the big rallies, more than 100,000 that were happening on the first 3 days of the protest, around the procedural dates of the first hearing at the parliament, yes, that was more or less anticipated. However, it was good to be reassured that so many people actually came out. What was less anticipated and very surprising positively for us was what happened next, because the coordination council, let's say, like, it's not very official, but the unofficial coordination council of the official big rallies, which are CSOs and opposition parties and so on, they said that guys, let's save our energy and center our protests around the procedural dates at the parliament. It was after 3 days, but then we saw that especially young people and students, they wouldn't go home, and they began protesting without any leadership whatsoever, even though even the first 3 days didn't have any centralized leadership. And they began randomly blocking streets, even the critical junctures of traffic infrastructure in Georgia. They even took a public vow to the ancestors, and just a public vow to protect Georgia at the Heroes Memorial in Tbilisi. The protest became very self-sustained, very self-organized, and very grassroots, which is, by the way, something that is extremely new to Georgia. So stereotypically, it used to be known that Georgians always need a centralized leadership to protest, always need a messiah to guide them, and also that if Georgians don't achieve their objectives in a couple of days, they get tired and they go home. So this protest, with everything that comes with it, people self-organizing on Facebook, offering each other overnight stays in their apartments in Tbilisi in case they're coming from regions to protest in Tbilisi, and all the self-organization with protective equipment and so on. This is really unprecedented in Georgian history. And my mother's generation, they say, they're like people who are now around 50, they're saying that the vibe and the atmosphere that is in the air now is really, really much like the 1980s independence struggle in Georgia. However, the difference is that in 1980s, the independence struggle was centered around prominent leaders and personalities, which is not the case now, which is in a way quite fascinating, and has been a positive trait, at least until now, of these protests, because the government propaganda, they were not able to demonize the protest by targeting any single individual or leader, which used to be the case before. And another thing is that the young people who are born and raised in free Georgia and the internet generation, they're quite light-spirited and they have a great humor and creativity, which really adds to the protest. Like the protest began as a very light-spirited protest. The atmosphere, the mood got quite tense and heavy when the Titushki attacks got violent around May 7, 8, 9, 10. However, it brought some lightheartedness back to itself once we saw how many of us were out there on May 11th at the Europe Square. Right now, as I said, we have broken all stereotypes about Georgians, that we need centralized leadership, that we cannot endure in time, and so on. But right now, the very urgent thing to resolve is how to channel all this protest into political representation and confidence in political parties. As for the mood, the mood is quite victorious in general, has been quite victorious, and people have begun to believe in themselves, and our national pride and confidence was quite boosted with this protest. The Georgian Dream government, like the what I call the Russian occupation government in Georgia, they have done a lot to undermine Georgia's national pride over the 12 years that they are in power. Of course, it wasn't done outright and very publicly, but with the subtle messages of how they view Georgia and Georgian identity, they have always managed to convince people that we are not really anything worthy as a nation. And I think right now the resistance, the protest itself has become a manifestation of national pride. I hope I didn't miss any point of your initial question, because I think I went to many different topics now. Please remind me if I forgot something.
That is amazing. And we are talking to Marika Mikiashvili, who is a researcher at Alte University and a party member of a Drua party in Georgia. She is currently in Tbilisi, Georgia, where tens of thousands of people are protesting since weeks daily in the streets of the capital, protesting against what they call a Russian law and Russian government. Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel so you do not miss interviews like this on the very important topics of democratic resilience worldwide. And Marika, you have already mentioned this Russian occupation government, as you call it, and people are protesting against what they call a Russian law. What is the role of Russia in this situation, and why is the protest so strongly linked with the allegedly Russian influence inside of the government?
Yes, Sergey. So, in your previous question, you asked whether it was really about the law or accumulated, and I should have been more specific. So, I think this law is a great trigger in the sense that this is a very specific in content and in time. So there's a very specific location where it is adopted, very specific timeline when it's adopted, and very specific content that is being adopted. But dissatisfaction with the Georgian Dream's pro-Russian policies have been there for quite some time. Some people have known it for from years ago. But they really began unmasking themselves as Russians when Ukraine was invaded full scale in February 2022, and they began this anti-Ukrainian, anti-Western rhetoric and didn't condemn Russia remotely enough, and they began scaring people that if opposition comes to power, then there will be a second front in Georgia, there will be war, and so on. And Georgians are, of course, very risk avoidant because we have been through several wars with Russia in the last 30 years. So yes, the dissatisfaction with the Georgian Dream's Russia policies have been there, definitely. And after the last year's attempt to introduce this law, then they restored flights with Russia. Well, technically, Russia restored flights with Georgia, but we all know that it couldn't have happened without the government's approval. So all of this was accumulated. However, nothing individual piece, no individual piece of puzzle was as major as this specific law. And it was probably harder to have general demonstrations like protesting the government's general policies. And as I said, this law is very specific in time and location. It's very targeted around the dates and procedural votes. So it is much easier to gather crowds around these targeted times, for example, rather than like general policies of pro-Russianness or corruption and so on. I hope you understand what I mean. Yes, so this government, they have quite extensive Russia ties. And investigative journalists, of course, they expose it quite a lot. Ivanishvili, the Russian oligarch who is behind everything and who has pocketed Georgia in his pocket, he made his billions in Russia in 90s. His mentality, his worldview, everything is Russian. He used to be, from what I know, the biggest individual shareholder of Gazprom. He used to have 1% of Gazprom, and it's said that he gave up that share once he entered politics in Georgia and became the ruler of the country. However, at this point, I would doubt everything, every information. And yes, there have been quite many investigative journalist reports that our security services are cooperating with Russian security services. And quite many times there have been like facts that they wouldn't let actual opposition Russians into the country. Journalists or Navalny team, for example, but they let hundreds of thousands of Russians without any security check and background, and even some Russians that I know, they have been advised to enter Georgia, saying that they were tourists and not anyone fleeing the Putin regime, because they would have problems entering Georgia if they said that they are dissidents or something. Yes, and the problem is that many people actually ask me how Georgia ended up with this Russian government, and there are several reasons for it. So Georgia had a really bad electoral law, proportional and majoritarian mix, which is actually the case in Hungary as well, and that is how Viktor Orban pocketed Hungary. Another reason is that Georgia is a hyper-centralized state. I joke that if you need to change a light bulb somewhere in the regions, you need Tbilisi's permission, and it's not really a joke. It's kind of reality. Whatever party has the parliament, they penetrate all and every layer of state administration, and they have endless resources of intimidation. But this is all backed by Ivanishvili's personal wealth. According to a Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe's research from several years ago, his personal wealth was equal to 33% of Georgia's GDP. So he has 1/3 of Georgia's GDP personal wealth. And if we also consider all his friends and networks and so on, it's insane amount of money. And in Georgia, there is no independent money other than his. So all other businesses, they are very vulnerable to state intimidation and state pressure. And that is why opposition parties and CSOs, they cannot be confidently funded by Georgian local money. And that is why all NGOs in Georgia really depend on Western money, and hence the law, because this law would label everyone who is receiving at least 20% of funding from abroad as foreign agent. In Georgian language, agent means a spy. It's a dictionary description of a spy agent. So they're saying that whoever receives Western money is a spy and essentially an enemy of the nation. So this also means that the West is the enemy. So with this law, they are flipping friends and enemies, and they are condemning everyone who does any community work as state enemy, because this law extends to basically everyone. It's not just so-called political NGOs, it's everyone, including animal shelters, single mothers, and just like women's issues, NGOs. And also, yes, the definition of foreign donor is also very extensive. Even if you receive just donations from abroad and you don't even know who you receive it from, you are still a foreign agent if it's if it's at least 20% of your income. And by the way, today it became known, one lawyer Saba gradually made the information public, that the Georgian Dream secretly amended the law before the third vote. And I don't even know if they had the right to do that, because the third vote is usually just the grammatical corrections and grammatical screening of the text, and not about the content of the text. But anyway, they amended the law to extend it to personalities as well. So those people, individuals who work at whatever the GD will be calling for in agent NGOs, and that is all NGOs in the country basically, except some sports related NGOs, they will be required to hand in arbitrary information about the organizations and about their employees as well, including secret personal informations that are supposed to be protected by state data protection and state protection services. And if they do not provide that information, there will be heavy fines imposed on them, on the individuals as well. I mean, and the fines, they will not be suspended if they sue at the court, and it's possible to fine them multiple times as well. Like there's no limit to fining them. So we see that they in secret adopted an amendment to the law which extends to people, and which aims to ultimately make it impossible for any active citizen to work in any organization in Georgia and to just live in Georgia, because they will have their accounts shut by banks from not being able to pay all these fines and so on. And also, it's very important that it's quite likely that Georgian election observers, NGOs, will be shut down with this law before elections or in October. And also they have adopted this offshores law, which lifts all taxes and duties from all money imported from offshores into Georgia. And there will also be no NGO left to investigate what is happening with that money. And we're very much fearing that Georgia is being prepared to be safe haven for Russian oligarch money, and like a territory reserved for Russian oligarchic money and influence. Yes.
Well, that is a very scary perspective. And we are talking to Marika Mikiashvili, who is a researcher at Alte University and a party member of a Drua party and a positional party in Georgia. And we are talking about the protests in Georgia and the fight of Georgian people against Russia's influence in their country. Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, and you will not miss such interviews like this. And Marika, you have already mentioned that these links to Russia and the uh, the way how the law has been written, it is absolutely resembling what Russia has introduced years ago to shut down their own civil society, and the fines and all these pressure mechanisms. They're also very likely. They're also very like to the situation which Russia has and which Belarus has. And in addition, when we see how the police acts against the protesters, it also resembles how Belarusian police acts and Russian police acts, but not only. You have used the word titushki in one of your answers, and for our audience who are not familiar with this term, titushki was called state-paid thugs in Ukraine under Yanukovych rule, when during the Maidan revolution Yanukovych corrupt regime, also linked to Russia, has just paid street thugs money. So the street thugs go and beat protesters, and these organized criminal bands, they were called by the Ukrainians titushki. So now, obviously, the same practice is being used by the Georgian government. So, do you see any parallels with what happened in Ukraine back then and what happened in Belarus? Because in Ukraine, the protesters have won, and in Belarus, the protests have been oppressed. What is the situation in Georgia? Where are the bottlenecks for the protest? What are the chances for success?
Yes, that is a very important question. Thank you very much, Sergey. So the parallels with Maidan, they come naturally because the Georgia's and Ukraine's fate and political development and history have been very much intertwined in the last 30 years, and before that as well, for probably a few hundred years since we've been under Russian occupation as the two nations. So Ukrainians are very much dear to Georgians, and the first days when the full-scale invasion happened, there was a poll, I think it was ACT poll, which measured that 87% of Georgians said that this is our war too. So we have a very big solidarity and we really perceive it as our war. And the Georgian fighters who fight in Ukraine have been our probably main source of national pride for these last couple of years. And this is why the Georgian Dream also hates them profoundly. And at some point, they even threatened that they will be stripping their citizenship because they're serving a foreign army. Anyway, the railing behind the Ukrainian cause in Georgia has been a really scary for the Georgian Dream, and that is why they doubled down on the propaganda that Georgia will be dragged into war also if the opposition ever comes to power again. So yes, I absolutely understand the parallels with Maidan. It's the same cause, like we are trying to get rid of the Russian influence and Russian governments in our countries, Yanukovych and now Ivanishvili. And Ivanishvili himself, like the Georgian government itself, makes parallels to Maidan. They've been accusing Georgians, NGOs, and USAID, by the way, also, and Georgian fighters in Ukraine of organizing a coup in Georgia. It was September last year, I guess, in Maidan style. So they are calling this Maidan, and in the same process, they are demonizing Maidan. They are saying that Maidan was a coup, like the fully Russian narrative, and they're also scaring people that you know what happened after Maidan, right? So the Russian invasion, I mean, and so like by extension, indirectly, they're saying that Russian army is their backing, and Georgian people would be punished by the Russian army if they ever get rid of the Georgian Dream. So they have said this. They have disseminated this narrative quite a lot, and almost a month ago, the oligarch Ivanishvili, he himself said that Georgia is not Georgia of Shevardnadze and not Ukraine of Yanukovych, and I'm not going anywhere. So he himself kind of drew parallels with Yanukovych, but he said that he's better than Yanukovych in the sense that it's impossible to remove him. And he directly said that NGOs are a tool in the hands of foreign power to impose foreign rule in Georgia. So they are absolutely aligned with the Russian narrative. As of where we are heading in terms of like where we are heading to the Maidan scenario or to the Belarus scenario, so I think that in Belarus, the security services were fully loyal to Lukashenko, and they also, from what I know, they got direct help from Russian OMON. In Georgia, yes, of course, the police is beating us big time, but I think most Georgians agree, experts included, that police service, like the police system, is not fully and unconditionally loyal to the Georgian Dream Party. So they do have some limit in terms of, like, for example, if extensive violence happens even more than it's happening already, if people are, I don't know, like massively mutilated or killed, then it's quite possible that the Georgian police system cannot deal with that morally or like practically and crack. Georgia is a very small society. Everyone knows everyone, and the moral pressure on people is quite high. and any violence sends shockwaves in population. Something that counts as violence in Georgia might not even count as violence elsewhere. I'm not saying this in terms of like idealistic sense that a Georgian policeman will not shoot a Georgian. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that practically, pressure on the police might be really high, because their extended family members, maybe even their immediate family members, are also out protesting. And whatever little legitimacy the Georgian Dream still has remaining is for two main reasons. Well, of course, pro-Russians are voting for Georgian Dream, but they cannot count on pro-Russians for electoral success only because that part of population is quite small in Georgia. So who they are counting on is that those people who ultimately want the European Union, but they're made to believe that opposition is a slave to foreign influence and they are LGBT. And the Georgian Dream will be delivering the European promise through dignity and sovereignty. So it's like they're still convincing some people that they're also going to the EU, but with different and better path than the opposition. And another factor is that the previous government, Saakashvili government, the UNM, many people still dislike UNM a lot for their poor human rights track record at the last couple of years in their rule, especially. So the Georgian Dream, even now, still manages to convince some people that they are less violent than the UNM. So if they show bigger violence and if they shoot real bullets, especially, they will lose whatever legitimacy they have. And I already have heard from several people that several GD voters also attended these protests, this last couple of weeks protests, because they were just very angry with the police violence that they saw. So they didn't necessarily agree with whatever demands we had, but they just wanted to express their anger with the police violence. Pragmatically, I think Yanukovych might have gambled that he thought that the public was split in external preferences, foreign policy preferences, and he could like crack down on half of population and the other would back it. But in Georgia, yes, as I said, the GD still manages to fool some people. But if it unmasks itself completely with the real bullets or something, they cannot count on having a big part of population. They will be antagonizing everyone in the country. 85% of this country wants EU integration. Ultimately. So that is why they're not able to say outright that they don't want EU. And by the way, it's one of the reasons why they managed to stay in power for so long, because sometimes when their practices were undemocratic or so on, people and the political class as well, they had this false sense of security, false illusion that no one in Georgia would be able to change the country's Western trajectory in defiance of the Georgian people, because Georgian people are so pro-Western and pro-EU. But we see that they're so entrenched in capturing institutions and captured institutions that they don't care about the public sentiments anymore. So in a way, there is a hope that maybe things will be less violent in Georgia than it was during Maidan in Ukraine. And there is a hope that the police will not fully back the regime, as I said. Army, it's very likely that they will stay out of it completely. Like if it gets to the army's inclusion in the process, it means that a horrible tragedy is happening in the streets. And I hope that it doesn't get to the army's involvement at all. But what I feel that the army will, at least they will not back the regime in suppressing us. I don't believe that they are not in solidarity with the protests, because this European identity and the anti-Russian sentiment and just the gut feeling that Georgians have that something is seriously wrong with this law, even without knowing much about this law, is so deeply rooted. I'm pretty sure that the large part of the army is also in solidarity with the protests. So yes, these are some hopes that maybe things will be less violent in Georgia. But I don't know. Let's see. And also about the deployment of Russian OMON. It's probably not a good idea for the Georgian Dream because in the police system, there's quite a lot of brainwashing that this is not a Russian law, or nothing's wrong with this law. It's about transparency, and the NGOs, they're being dramatic and hysterical for various reasons and to protect their money and so on. So not everyone in police system is ideologically defending a Russian regime, and if you put a Russian guy next to him to physically fight Georgian demonstrators, it can backfire a lot because Georgians might blind themselves a lot to Russian influences, but fighting alongside a Russian, it's something that will not enable them to blind themselves anymore to Russian influences. Um, but
especially
yeah,
especially taking into consideration that 20% of territory of Georgia is being occupied by Russia. So it is
yes.
not like in 2014 in Ukraine or 2013 or before the first Russian invasion and occupation of Crimea, or in Belarus in 2020. Like here, Russian troops are clearly occupants on the Georgian territory. But what I wanted to ask you is, you have mentioned that police is like, police thinks that maybe it's about transparency, maybe it's not about the oppression. But what we know from both Belarusian and from Ukrainian cases, Ukraine during the Yanukovych time, I mean, we know that the police officers, they got extra paid from illegal state-controlled funds, extra to their salaries. It were practically bribes to the police officers to increase their loyalty to the regime, so they could be motivated to fight the protesters, because they knew when the opposition wins, then these extra payments to their salary, which could have exceeded their salary by several times, they will just stop. Is there are any information of such of these practices in case of Georgia? And another question is, what is the role of the church and the conservative circles in this conflict?
Yes, the police does get some bonuses to their salaries, but there hasn't been, I haven't heard of a report of something extraordinary happening in terms of monetary reward of the police. Um, I would just say that in my understanding, in Belarus at least, yes, of course, it was about identity and democracy too. But in our case, it's very much about identity. It's not just that I don't like this regime because they're not democratic and let's change them. It's like people are increasingly seeing this as an existential struggle and potential loss of Georgia's independence. So people are increasingly seeing this as an independence movement and independence struggle. And in a way, it's impossible for this not to reach all layers of society. And while some in the police will probably remain loyal to the regime till the end, it will still affect the others. And I have some insider reports that what is happening, large part of the police is quite unhappy with what is happening. It just needs more pushing and needs persistence on our side. And about persistence, um, now there are some reports that the Georgian Dream is trying to soften this law to adopt something a better version that will suit the EU better or something, which will serve the purpose of tricking our Western partners that there's some sort of any remaining democracy in Georgia, and to make the protesters go home in frustration, maybe in false sense of victory. However, there's the sense in Georgia that oligarch Ivanishvili is just omnipotent, and if they adopt a softer version of this law and protesters to a degree even go home, maybe more people will perceive it as frustration rather than victory, because they will think that, oh, this is what he wanted in the first place. He wanted a softer law, so he played us all like puppets. and this was all for nothing, because no matter what we would have done, he would have adopted the softer law anyway. But in any case, their strategy now is to they really hope for the summer holidays. Their strategy is that we will go home, that we will get tired. And I think one of your questions was also about whether we would get tired. I actually do not know what will happen in that regard, especially if the softer version of this law is adopted, which opposition parties and the president of Georgia, who is the only independent institution, but she doesn't have like many executive powers, unfortunately. We're really against any softening of this law. Do not negotiate with the enemy. Do not negotiate with Russians. Just withdraw the law altogether. But anyway, it's so there it depends on many steps and many things that spontaneously might happen. But even if Georgians, to a degree, go home or go on summer vacations, we have elections in October. So this sentiment will not go without a trace. It will again be triggered at elections, and all the emotions and anger will again be accumulated at elections, especially that no one expects that the elections will be free and fair, unfortunately. And by the way, some people have told me, especially Ukrainians, that the Georgians are too festive, too peaceful in the protests, and this is not the way to like make a Russian regime go. All the singing and dancing at the protests. But I would like to underline to everyone that yes, I understand what they mean, and they have a point. But we have some deadlines in our heads. First, the presidential veto that is coming, and another is the October elections. And even though none of us expects that it will be free or fair, there are still some remaining hope that maybe with some Western pressure, maybe with some other pressures, we might be able to unseat them in October, more or less in a bloodless way, in a velvet way. So the October elections is a deadline in our heads. I think if and when the elections are rigged, the protests after that will probably be different in level of anger and in manifestation of it, rather than it is today, because then there won't be any deadline left. Then it will be like nothing's upcoming. We have to deal with the situation right now, right here. However, it really depends on Georgian Dream whether we get to the October elections at all, because the political class wants it, the people want it. But if they just like double down on violence, and just if violence keeps increasing, the country might become ungovernable completely before October, possibly in June before summer holidays. So the Georgian Dream holds the key of rest or unrest in the Georgian society. If they do adopt the softer law or whatever, it's likely that it will be some sort of a purgatory until October elections, and it will be neither full protest nor full repressions, and just like a war of nerves until October and beyond. As for the church and the ultra-conservative groups that you asked about, unfortunately, the management of the Church of Georgia, the high leadership, they back the government, and they back this law, and they are very vulnerable to Russian influence, and they also receive a lot of donations from this government. So this is actually the moment when Georgian Dream is the absolute last Russian government in Georgia, and Russia knows that there's no way for any government to pursue pro-Russian policy after them. Even these guys, they were not elected as pro-Russians. They unmasked themselves after 10 years, after they had already pocketed all institutions. And electoral law, and now it's going to be fully proportional, will not allow any party to have disproportionately big representation and a single party, one party rule inside the parliament, which was the case before. So they will be losing Georgia once and for all. By extension, they will be losing South Caucasus as well, because historically, Georgia being in the center of the region, whatever happened here really extended to other nations to the Caucasus, especially that now Armenia is drifting away from Russia. And if Armenia has a very strongly pro-Western neighbor with Georgia, I mean, in the face of Georgia, or how to say it, then situation in South Caucasus will change a lot. And the Russian influences inside the church, they also know that the end is near for them, because once the GD is gone and the new government comes, the most probably the relationship with the church will be subjected to fundamental revision. The church itself is very likely to need a reform soon. And of course, the conservatives inside the church, they do not want to subject themselves to reform. GD has violent proxies, such as Alte group, and they have unleashed violence before. Their violence even resulted in the death of one cameraman in Georgia in 2021. However, how to say, these violent pro-Russian, pro-GD, ultra-conservative groups, they're not self-flowing and aren't self-organized, and they are like government rallied. They need government's guidance, and they need so once the GD is gone, they're basically headless. It's actually interesting to observe how the protest movement, how our resistance reclaimed some of the national symbols, because the GD tried to monopolize national symbols. They tried to monopolize the understanding of Georgian patriotism, which they injected a lot with Russian understanding of Georgian patriotism, of course, like the Russian worldview and Russian mentality. For example, what I mean is that under UNM rule, just for example, because it was also 21st century, the last 20 years, the understanding was that the Georgian is modern, hardworking, European, and deserves the best. And that there was a very big accent on a statehood of Georgia. The Georgian Dream, on the other hand, and oligarch Ivanishvili, they have multiple times stated that the biggest achievement of Georgian civilization is Georgian feast and supra, what we call it. Basically food and drinks, of course, and the singing and dancing. Of course, I'm not underestimating the cultural significance of Georgian feast, and it's not just food and singing. It has a soul. It has a big cultural soul. But nevertheless, we have so many masterpieces in our history, like just the Night in the Panther's Skin, the poem of 12th century. So they're looking at Georgians through the Russian prism, dancing, singing, khachapuri, khinkali, and the Russians are famously okay with their colonized nations to have their identity, to speak their language, well, to some degree, of course. But they cannot ask for statehood, and they cannot be independent, and so on. And that is the Georgian Dream's understanding of Georgia as well. They have monopolized the patriotism. They have monopolized the church for sure, and they call us Satanists. Yes, the Prime Minister of Georgia back in 2023 called the protesters against the Russian law Satanists. And they very much like to call us Satanists, call us LGBT, and who are bloody and against everything Georgian, undermining Georgia's history and sovereignty. And it was actually really, really cool that this Easter, May 5th, the protesters, we met it in front of the parliament. There's a church, and we met it in a church there. It was a protest Easter in a church. And Muslim activists and atheist activists, everyone was there. They posted that they were also coming. There were pictures with them. Ethnic Azerbaijanis of Georgia, for example, they were also there. I think some Jews as well. So it was a demonstration of some sort of secularism together with reclaiming our church and so on. And I really have this feeling that so in some nations, derussification, decolonization happens more or less step by step. But now it really feels like everything is culminating in Georgia together. The governance, the church, all the Russian narratives, and that is probably what makes it extremely hard because it's Russia's last push, and we are dealing with Russia's full-blown last push in Georgia, because they know that once we win, they're losing all influence in Georgia, in religion, in church, in governance, in society, and so on. And we cannot afford to lose this battle for sure. And as I said, there are some hopes that maybe the police system can be cracked. And also, yeah, I would very much dislike the possibility of protests going on holidays over the summer. But as we are centering our focus around the elections, I wouldn't. I don't want people to think that if even if our protests go slower over the summer, that we have given up and so on, because we will be very much centering on unseating the Georgian Dream at elections on October 26th. If they just let us get to that point, because it's well, if they like do a major crackdown and repression before, we will likely answer that. But it's extremely important. It's vital that the West does not legitimize elections for them, and they should start observing elections in Georgia with magnifying glasses from today, because elections in Georgia are not rigged on the election day proper. The intimidation, the violence, the vote buying, the pressure, everything that is happening happens months before. So it's already underway. Families are like being scared into voting for the GD, or like intimidated, or threats of getting fired. There are even threats of somebody from the family being jailed for some planted reason if they don't vote for the GD. Even more so, there are promises that family members will be released if they vote for the GD and so on. And usually they require people to take a telephone shot of who they voted for on the ballot. Yes, and then they send these telephone shots of the pictures who they voted for to the GD people. Yes, and I have personally seen, because I was an election observer, that somebody like circled GD, so they voted for GD, and then they crossed it and voted for the opposition. And there was even a small message that I was made to vote for GD first, then I crossed it, and please count my vote. Please count my vote for the opposition. So there have been many cases like that. And also, one thing I would like to underline is that GD is not behaving like culturally Georgian at all. Traditionally, even the violence has a code, right? So women, children, and the elderly of the family have always been off the table for Georgians. And suddenly they're sending, there are thousands of telephone calls against active citizens. They're terrorizing children of politicians, like 11-year-old daughter of one of the politicians, pregnant wives of politicians, who are like publicly known to be pregnant. It's not that they happen to be pregnant. They post a lot and about the pregnancy, so everyone knows that they're having a baby. They threaten and terrorize this pregnant woman, not about herself, but about her husband, for example, who is politically active. But anyway, what does it matter, right? And a 73-year-old father of one of the activists was also beaten, like physically confronted. And if traditionally I would be calm about my family members who are 80 or 90 or something, or if I were a man, and if I would be calm about the women of my family, but they are removing all senses of security that we might have. So that's why they're deliberately going into no-go zones of Georgian culture to absolutely terrorize us, so that we don't have any sense of security, and we don't think that my grandma who's 84 is safe. At least she'll be safe. That's what I would think. But now I don't think that anymore, right? So even in violence, they're not Georgians.
That is, of course, a very scary situation, and shares once again the links between Ivanishvili's party Georgian Dream with Russia, with Russian terrorist regime and with Russia's oppressive practices. And that reminds us once again that this fight is not a sprint, it's a marathon, and a lot of endurance and strength is required to win this fight. All eyes are on Georgia now, as we know that it is decided there the destiny of Caucasus, the destiny of Russia's influence in the region, and it
And the
is
Black Sea as well, yeah.
Absolutely, it is important what is happening there, and this fight of Georgians for their freedom is not a new fight. It is continuous since several decades of years, since 2003 at least. And that was an interview with Marika Mikiashvili, who is a researcher at Alte University and a party member of Drua oppositional party in Georgia, who is a passionate freedom champion and who has explained us what is happening in Georgia, being in Tbilisi, Georgian capital, amid the protest. Thank you so much, dear Marika, and don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next interviews. Thank you, Marika, for your interview, and stay strong.
Thank you, Sergej. Thank you.